Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our third episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Five for Breakfast. This is a significant week in Washington as preparations continue for the transition of power, with President-elect Donald Trump set to be sworn into office on Monday, January 20th at noon. In Congress, committee assignments are being finalized. Last night, the Communications and Technology Subcommittee announced its membership, and Representative Richard Hudson from North Carolina will be its chair. Representative Doris Matsui from California will be the ranking member, and Rep. Rick Allen from Georgia will serve as vice chair. And we're excited to see returning members, and we'll be getting to know some new members. A big development for fiber as NTI approved the final BEAD proposals for Louisiana and Delaware this week. These milestones are critical towards bringing high-speed broadband to unserved and underserved communities, bridging the digital divide and driving economic growth. As we learned last week on Fiber for Breakfast, Louisiana will expand fiber connectivity to over 200,000 unserved and underserved homes throughout its program. Yesterday, the White House issued an executive order on advancing U.S. leadership in artificial intelligence infrastructure that will help ensure that the U.S. has the infrastructure needed to be a global leader. In addition to power, fiber connectivity is a vital aspect of AI data centers and their ability to transmit mass amounts of data quickly and securely. This executive order also acknowledges permitting continues to be a roadblock for AI data centers as it does for broadband infrastructure deployment. The Fiber Broadband Association is looking forward to working with the administration and Congress to remove barriers and expedite permitting for fiber connectivity, whether that be for supporting AI or delivering broadband connectivity. So Hawaii and North Dakota are on the verge of making fiber history. On Friday, Hawaiian Telecom announced plans to make Hawaii the first fully fiber-enabled state by 2026. That's amazing, 2026. Through a $1.7 billion initiative. And we're also celebrating North Dakota's achievement of near universal fiber coverage. These milestones highlight fiber's unmatched ability to transform communities with superior connectivity, economic growth, and quality of life improvements. As we enter this year, the Fiber Broadband Association is working its way across North America with an amazing lineup of regional Fiber Connect workshops. In a few weeks here on February 11th, we'll be in San Antonio. So please join us February 11th. We'll have our first regional workshop. And then the day afterwards, we'll be heading up to Austin for a Texas Capitol fly-in. Then we'll be in Philadelphia in March. Our Fiber Day in the Hill is in April. Our big Fiber Connect 2025 conference is June 1st to 4th in Nashville. Then we'll be in Anchorage, Alaska in July, Toronto in August, Spokane in September, Scottsdale, October, Kansas City, November. And then we close the year with our premier member meeting in Palm Springs, California, December 8th through 9th. That brings us today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Annie Stroud, the Broadband Director of Generation West Virginia, who's going to be discussing breaking barriers, tackling pole attachment challenges to expand rural broadband. But before I formally start today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning, everyone who's joined us. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, please keep in mind all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within the control panel in the upper right corner of the screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's presentation. This session is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Vineet Ingar, the Executive Director of Connect LA, who discussed Louisiana's fiber broadband first mover advantage. So Vineet discussed Louisiana's process in awarding its NTI BEAD funding, of which 95.4% went to fiber providers. Louisiana is the first state to have its final proposal approved by NTI and will be breaking ground with BEAD deployment this quarter. If you missed that session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Annie Stroud, the Broadband Director of Generation West Virginia, who will be discussing breaking barriers and tackling pole attachment challenges to expand rural broadband. Annie leads Generation West Virginia's broadband program and leverages her project management background and expertise in economic and community development to expand broadband access and create more opportunities for young people to live, work, and prosper in West Virginia. In her role as broadband director, Annie works closely with West Virginia regional planning, development councils, regional funders, community stakeholders, and West Virginia's Department of Economic Development Office of Broadband to facilitate connections and provide technical assistance for both broadband infrastructure and digital inclusion projects. Since 2020, GWV Broadband Program has helped communities secure over $46 million in state federal funding, combined with local match totaling $68 million in broadband investments in West Virginia. Generation West Virginia is a partner with Connect Humanity Appalachia Digital Accelerator Program, and through that program facilitated digital equity plans for 18 West Virginia counties focused on strategies to improve access to affordable internet. Annie currently serves as a member of the West Virginia Digital Equity Steering Committee and the West Virginia Broadband Workforce Council. With all that, welcome Annie. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and I'll hand things over to Annie to get things rolling.
All right. Thanks so much, Gary. Excited to be here. Well, thanks, again for having us. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about one of the challenges West Virginia is facing here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to start and give a little bit of context, I guess, for, I know there's folks all over who are probably popping on today. Generation West Virginia is a statewide nonprofit. Our mission is really to figure out how to equip young West Virginians with the skills, give them the opportunities they need to be able to develop careers, stay in the state, thrive, and not have to leave West Virginia. Historically been one of those states where a lot of the younger population has left to seek new opportunities. We have 4 different programs that we run. One is actually started out as a software training program. We've shifted over to data analytics. It's a 6-month training program that preps people to go right into entry-level jobs in data analytics. We have a fellowship, which is kind of a professional development networking opportunity. We have a career connector that's a job board, resume bank. We do talent search for folks in the state. And then we have broadband, which has always been a little bit of the odd sheep out. But we recognized very early on that the lack of connectivity throughout the state was one of the many barriers that was making it difficult for people to either move back to the state and work remotely and or stay in the state and develop their own businesses and careers here. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about the Generation West Virginia Broadband Program. We actually started in really digging into this in 2020. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic made it exceptionally clear, how stark the digital divide was, especially in some of these really rural states. And we were able to work with the Claude W. Benedum Foundation to kind of come up with a plan to address this question. The big question we had was, why weren't West Virginia broadband projects getting funded? The divide was clear, other states were getting funded. So we kind of set out to test a model to see if we could figure out a way to help facilitate that. We did have a broadband enhancement council and broadband office that we could work with, which was really exciting. And the model that we came up with was this wraparound technical assistance, where essentially our team, we had a small group of folks, including some industry experts, grant writers, engineering, legal assistants, who, when someone would come to us with a project idea, we'd say, all right, what are the steps that need to happen to make this be a successfully funded project? So worked very closely with the state, with our regional planning and development councils, and that was an incredibly successful program. We still offer those services today. I'll talk about the timeline a little bit more, but with BEAD, that part of what we do has been a little bit less relevant as we've been waiting for the BEAD process to kind of work its way through. At the same time, infrastructure is obviously the critical first step. Without the fiber, no one's going to be connecting to anything. But in a state like West Virginia that has a lot of challenges economically, socially, those kinds of things, the adoption, access, affordability piece is the other critical part as providers are building out we're already hearing some examples where some of these earlier funded projects aren't having the take rate that were expected, especially with, you know, ACP being gone. Folks either aren't prioritizing it or they don't have the ability to afford it. So we've also really shifted and did a lot of the digital equity planning with the ARC Arise grant through Connect Humanity last year to really start thinking about how we're going to address that piece, because that's the other critical component. So 2 pieces moving forward. It's been very exciting. I came to the program actually in 2023, so I'm fairly new in the scope of things, but came right in the middle of a whole bunch of changes and shifts, which has been very exciting. All right, next slide. All right, so if you're not familiar with our beautiful mountain state, here's West Virginia. As far as the landscape of broadband access, I feel like in many ways West Virginia has been lucky in that the lack of broadband access was identified and started to be addressed fairly early compared to, I know some states didn't even have a broadband office until BEAD came out. The West Virginia legislature did create the Broadband Enhancement Council in 2017. There were some other regional planning efforts that had started earlier on. We worked really closely with an organization called Regional Optical Communications, which is a consortium of several regional planning development councils. I think the original iteration actually was in 2008, but they kind of reinvigorated it around 2019 to really look at how do we address these connectivity challenges in our communities, because obviously if you're involved in economic development and doing any sort of either local business development or trying to bring business in, that consistent, reliable connectivity is really critical. Again, COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the challenges, especially in a lot of the more rural areas where you had, all the kids at home trying to do remote work. And, I don't have any of the figures in front of me right now, but the numbers of teachers that just didn't have students that could get online were shocking. So that was a major, I think, eye-opening moment for the folks that weren't already on board for broadband expansion. Again, we kind of got up and running with our broadband technical assistance in 2020. That's kind of when that started, worked again very closely with those development councils. And basically the way that would work is our regional planning and development councils, several of them had done some regional studies on, all right, here are some potential projects in our areas. And when a fund would open, they would come to us and say, all right, here are the list of projects, and we would look at the funding sources and be able to kind of match them up and do triage to say, okay, who's ready? Where do we have providers that are ready? Where do we have folks that have the capacity? And if we didn't have providers, try and do some of the outreach to make that happen. Officially, the Office of Broadband was established in 2021. It has been a small but mighty team led by Kelly Workman, who's done a fantastic job in building a really, really strong team, both staff members and contractors. And they've been a really great partner, and I think are a big reason why West Virginia is actually where we are in our BEAD process, because they've done a really good job and pushed pretty hard to make sure that this is happening. They very much understand the importance of it. Our broadband office is housed in our Office of Economic Development, which I think was probably a purposeful placement in terms of the importance to the state moving forward. So as what happened across the country, BEAD really shifted the scope of what was possible. I think previous to the BEAD announcements, we'd been just working to get as, state, federal, whatever funding sources we could find. West Virginia, because of our demographics and our, state of connectivity, has been lucky in that we have a lot of investment coming through the BEAD program, which has been a huge task to plan for, but has been a really big shift. Where we are in that process, and I'll probably talk about this in a second here too, is the final proposal for West Virginia is due by April, and everything we're hearing is that we're on track for that. So, and real quick, this map here too is the most recent map that I've seen of fiber access in the state. So the pink on the map here are fiber, and the blue are cable providers. as you can see, a lot of the areas that are not pink are very, very rural areas, but there are people there that need broadband access. So next slide, please. There we go. Again, we've had a lot of investment already through some of these other funding sources, through ARPA, through the state and local fiscal recovery fund, capital projects. There's a lot of our locations are covered by RDOF. Of course, we haven't seen a lot of that deployment yet. And then also there's been some funds through the Appalachian Regional Commission, USDA Reconnect, some Community Connect, Community Development Block Grants. All of those, though, still don't reach that, total number that West Virginia needs to cover everyone, which is that 1.2 billion. We actually were involved. Regional Optical Communications did a statewide study looking at costs for deployment, and when NTIA came back with 1.2 billion, we were all a little bit pleased because we had estimated that was probably the mid-range of what it was going to cost. So we were glad that our estimates were pretty close there. Where we are right now in the selection process is actually all providers had to get their information in by mid-December. So the state is actually going back and forth with providers to put the final proposal together, which is pretty exciting. We're looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. It's been the big question here for a couple of years. We also, on the digital equity side, West Virginia has received their state capacity grant for the year, which is $9 million, which is going to include several sub-grant programs along with additional planning and other resources. All right, next slide. All right, some of the challenges. Many of the challenges that I'm going to talk about here are unique to, or are not unique to any rural area across the country. I had the opportunity to speak at Mount Connect this year, and the mountains may be more dramatic and they're a lot taller than ours are, but a lot of the challenges that I heard from folks in some of the rural western states and are very similar when you get into some of the issues with very challenging topography, low population densities, locations spread all over the place, these little patchworks of clusters of locations that need service, but maybe 10 miles out from the nearest existing fiber line. So this little map down here is actually not that spread out in terms of locations. This is one of the clusters that actually looks pretty good. This is about 15 minutes from one of the slightly larger towns in West Virginia, but there's a couple small ones here where like Sophia and Coal City, both of their populations are around maybe 1,200 folks. So you're looking at pretty low population densities and these little clusters that are actually not even within those town limits. Other issues, economics in West Virginia are a huge problem. We have a poverty rate that, I think this year is around 16, it's usually between 16 and 17%. If anyone hasn't looked at poverty rates recently, that means for, a two-person household that they're existing on less than $20,000 a year. So the economic factors are significant. And again, going back to what I said earlier, are why I think the adoption efforts are going to be a really critical piece in West Virginia, especially in lieu of the Affordable Connectivity program. Another piece is just local capacity for local community governments. I know when we were doing a lot of the projects that had to be funded through like a local county or planning department and things like that, a lot of them have more pressing concerns like water access, sewage, road conditions that they have to spend their time on first. In that hierarchy of needs, connectivity is really critical, but you have to make sure people are getting clean running water first. So that was a challenge early on, a little bit less so now because the way BEAD is being deployed, it's going straight to providers, but that has been a challenge across distance middle mile, especially in some of those north central parts of the state has been a challenge. We've got a very significant project running through those right now that is finally underway, which is really exciting. And then there's the permitting processes. which for any construction project are going to be a little bit of a hiccup. Most folks are used to working with them. There's your easements, your railroad, your road crossings. But the one that's really been a big issue here, as I'm sure it has been for other folks, has been the full attachment process. So we'll jump into that. Next slide. So this is just, if you haven't had a chance to look at a telephone pole anytime recently, or a power pole, this is from the utilityindustry.info. I was trying to find a nice clean one. Here's your telephone pole. The top level, of course, is your electric space, supply space. Then you've got your gap. I know that the exact number of inches varies. I think it's 40 some. Then you have your comm space, and that's where your telephone, fiber, coax, any of your comm space, and broadband cables are attached. The trick when you get out into some of these rural areas, I didn't have any very good full pictures, so apologies. We have very forested terrain, a lot of hills, a lot of creeks. And as you can see, this one pole here on the right, you can't really see it, but that's actually in kind of right next to the road, between the road and stream bed. Winter storms like the ones that just came through the East Coast, we get a lot of downed trees and downed lines and people running into poles. Just this last storm, a whole section of my town lost power because somebody slid into and knocked over some poles that they shouldn't have. So just to give context again, if you haven't had a chance to look at this is what we're talking about. And a lot of the challenges that come out, of course, are when a provider is building out, ideally they would be able to use existing poles to put their fiber on instead of putting in new ones. And the pole attachment process requires providers to outline which poles they're attaching to, do an engineering review, submit to pole owners exactly what that looks like, and then pole owners, of course, to take that permit application, review those, make sure they're up to standard, approve, not approve, say what changes need to be made, and then send those back to the providers. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's an issue. I will also just flag too, because Gary and I were talking about this earlier. West Virginia does not have a lot of underground deployment, especially in the rural areas. The cost effectiveness of that is really challenging. We do have, again, mountainous, hilly terrain, a lot of rocks, and there's some parts of the state where it makes sense, but across the board, most of the fiber deployment has been aerial.
Annie, we're getting close to running out of time, so let's get into the key
challenges here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the biggest challenge that we're seeing already, I've mentioned some of the funding we already had. We're already starting to see delayed timelines because of the pole attachment process. This obviously is a big issue for managing your grant deadlines, potentially losing access to grants, time-sensitive grant funds. But the biggest piece about it comes around the increased and unpredictable costs, both for submitting the pole attachment, pole permits, and then also for the make-ready costs and actually pole replacements if that's necessary down the road. We can move on. So why is this happening? The pole inventory itself is aging in the state. A lot of the poles have not been replaced in a really long time, or they were, put out for telephone lines. They're expensive to replace. They're expensive to maintain. We've been hearing complaints from providers that pole owners might be using some of this broadband funding to help them replace aging inventory that needs replaced otherwise. So there's been a lot of complaints around that. But, I think a big piece is really just the lack of capacity. I think that providers sometimes maybe aren't submitting the best executed attachment requests. The owners, I think, don't always have the urgency to address their own internal staffing capacity to actually review these permits that are coming in. in these giant blocks, and we're expecting more, obviously, with BEAD. Pole owners have been using contractors in some cases. There's been instances where maybe the contractors were not doing the highest quality job, and providers are having to go back and correct errors, which delays the timeline. And then, I mean, in a big picture sense, there's some workforce concerns. So we just don't have enough engineers in the state accessible to review all of these on both sides to make the process happen. Another big challenge, obviously, has been different processes for different pole owners, different, costs, different processes, different places to send it to has been a struggle, especially for providers where you might have a whole different range of folks that you have to work with to get your project through. And then, historically, we haven't had a super clear dispute mitigation process for when the disputes come up and requests coming back. And there's not been a really clear regulatory path for providers moving forward. Next. A few things that are happening to make this happen. So a previous effort that the Public Service Commission in West Virginia did is they did issue a joint resolution. Initially, providers, if there was a pole that was jointly owned and had by power companies and your, telecom folks, you had to submit two separate applications. They've streamlined that, so there is only one. But the biggest response, has been this development of a task force at our Public Service Commission, and they're looking at a couple different solutions. One is a rapid response team, basically a mediation process to avoid any sort of official litigation, legal battles associated with permits. Looking at replicating some of the FCC reporting on a state level for developing a pole inventory, which doesn't currently exist. And the other piece has been this list of approved contractors from the pole owners. This has happened on individual levels, like individual providers have done this with individual pole owners to develop a process that works, but they're starting to do this on a statewide level, and hopefully that will really help streamline the process. And then again, some providers have individual agreements that have really streamlined the process, again, including approved contractors and certain things that they're allowed to do. This task force is made up of pole owners, internet service providers, other stakeholders, and their final report is due today. So we're all actually waiting on pins and needles here to see what the report is. Unfortunately, it didn't come out this morning, so I don't have any updates, but we'll keep that in mind here.
Thanks, Annie. I mean, obviously, this is a really thorny issue. Our recent fiber deployment cost study that's going to get ready to be released is showing that the difference between having to rent poles versus having your own poles is a difference between $4.90 a foot in deployment versus $7. So it's extremely more costly. But I think the bigger issue is the pole replacement, who's responsible, and then also just again, getting people to respond. And obviously, as pole owners, it becomes very complex on who's responsible for replacing the poles and the cost. So one of the questions that came in is, hey, with $19 million left over from ARPA, how does West Virginia, going to fund this pole replacement program?
Yeah. I mean, the pole replacement piece hasn't moved forward. Someone introduced it as part of another bill. I think Delegate Linville in 2022, and it didn't get passed. I think that's something that other states have really successfully been able to put in place to help mitigate some of these costs. Because the electric utilities are saying, hey, we weren't planning on replacing all these poles right now. And the providers are saying, we really need this done, and we shouldn't have to foot that cost. So I think some states have really successfully done that. That is something that is supposed to be introduced in this year's legislative session. We'll see. There's some hope that is able to come in to help mitigate some of the cost pieces, because that cost is something that actually for grant funded programs, a lot of people don't necessarily budget for, because the range of what the cost
West
of
Virginia,
is too wide.
Do you guys have you seen any state that you think does as well, as good policies on pole attachments and pole replacement?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have been keeping an eye on some of our surrounding states that have put in these full replacement programs, and I think that I know Ohio, North Carolina, Kentucky, all have programs, some of which have already started with, millions of dollars going towards full replacements already, which I think would be really helpful here. That's one piece that we don't have in place quite yet.
All right. Well, listen, Annie, thanks so much. We really appreciate all the work that you and your organization are doing in West Virginia, a very important state to get connected. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to get back together next Wednesday with Chandler Vaughn, the Associate Director, Virginia Office of Broadband, and Brandon Hernan, the Director of Center for Geospatial Information Technology at Virginia Tech. And they're going to be discussing mapping broadband coverage, universal access for all Virginia. So you're not going to want to miss that. So thanks again. Appreciate everybody joining us, and we look forward to getting together next Wednesday. Thanks, Annie.
Thanks so much. Y'all take care.